What if death isn't the end? What if certain people have discovered a way to cheat mortality itself? Not through medicine, not through luck, but through time. Across history, there are documented cases of individuals who should have died, who technically did die, only to reappear days, months, or even decades later, completely unharmed. And the strangest part, they all share one impossible thing in common. These are 10-time travel survivors who are immune to death. Imagine falling through ice into the darkest, coldest water on Earth. Your lungs fill with freezing liquid. Your heart stops. Your brain shuts down. And for 72 hours, you are clinically, medically, undeniably dead. Now, imagine opening your eyes on an autopsy table, gasping for air, while a coroner stands above you holding a scalpel. This is not a horror movie. According to declassified Soviet documents, this actually happened, and the man who experienced it claimed he had visited somewhere beyond death itself. In January 1987, a 43-year-old fisherman named Dmitry Volkov set out alone onto the frozen surface of Lake Baikal in Siberia. Lake Baikal is no ordinary body of water. It is the deepest freshwater lake on the planet, plunging more than a mile into the earth. Local legends speak of strange lights beneath the ice, of divers who descended and never returned, of sounds that echo from depths no human has ever reached. The indigenous Buryat people called it the Sacred Sea and believed it was a gateway between worlds. Dmitry Volkov was about to discover why. That morning, Dmitry hiked to his usual fishing spot, drilled a hole through the ice, and settled in for a quiet day. But something went wrong. The ice beneath him cracked without warning. Before he could react, he plunged into water so cold it would have stopped his heart within seconds. The hole sealed above him. Dmitry Volkov vanished beneath the frozen surface. Search teams found his body 3 days later, trapped beneath a thick shelf of ice nearly 40 feet from where he fell. His skin was blue. His core temperature measured just 18 degrees Celsius. 3 separate physicians examined him at the morgue in Irkutsk. All 3 signed death certificates. There was no pulse, no brain activity, no breath. Dmitry Volkov was dead by every medical standard known to science. His body was transported to a regional facility for autopsy, and a coroner prepared to make the first incision. And then, Dmitry opened his eyes. According to hospital records that remained classified until 2019, the coroner stumbled backward in shock as Dmitry suddenly gasped, sat upright, and looked around the room in complete confusion. His first words, reportedly, were not questions about where he was or what had happened. Instead, he asked a single question that haunts researchers to this day. How long was I gone? When doctors explained that he had been dead for 72 hours, Dmitry shook his head. To him, only seconds had passed. He described the moment he fell through the ice, the shock of the freezing water, the darkness closing in. But then, something changed. Instead of oblivion, he found himself standing in what he called a corridor of light. He was not alone. Figures surrounded him, beings without clear faces, radiating a warmth that contradicted everything about the frozen death he had just experienced. They spoke to him, though not with words. They communicated directly into his mind, and what they told him was this: your thread was tangled. You were not supposed to end here. We are returning you to the correct moment. Dmitry remembers stepping forward. The light consumed him, and then he was lying on a cold metal table, staring up at a terrified coroner. Medical experts could not explain his survival. 72 hours without oxygen should have caused catastrophic brain damage. His organs should have failed. His tissue should have begun decomposing. Yet Dmitry walked out of that hospital 2 weeks later with no lasting physical effects, none whatsoever. But something had changed in him. In the years following his impossible resurrection, Dmitry reportedly developed an uncanny ability to sense danger moments before it struck. He avoided a factory collapse that killed 6 co-workers by refusing to enter the building that morning. He stepped off a bus seconds before it was struck by a truck. He pulled his grandson away from a falling tree branch that would have crushed the boy's skull. Each time, Dmitry said he simply knew. He could feel death approaching, and he knew how to step aside. Before his eventual death from natural causes in 2011, Dmitry Volkov gave one final interview to a Russian journalist. His words were chilling. "I am not afraid of death anymore. I have already met it, and it sent me back." Picture this. You receive a phone call in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end tells you that your sister has died in a house fire. Her body was found in the bedroom. Dental records confirmed her identity. You attend her funeral, watch her coffin lowered into the ground, and spend weeks drowning in grief. And then, 3 weeks later, she knocks on your front door. She is alive, unburned, completely unharmed, and she has no memory of any fire ever happening. This is exactly what the Marsh family experienced in the autumn of 2003. And to this day, no one can explain it. Helena Marsh was 34 years old, a quiet accountant living alone in a modest home in suburban Manchester, England. She had no enemies, no dramatic history, no reason for anyone to wish her harm. On the night of October 14th, 2003, her neighbors were awakened by the smell of smoke. By the time fire crews arrived, Helena's house was fully engulfed in flames. The heat was so intense that windows exploded outward and the roof collapsed within minutes. No one escaped. When firefighters finally entered the smoldering ruins, they found a single body in the upstairs bedroom, burned beyond recognition. The flesh had melted from the bones. The face was unidentifiable, but dental records told a clear story. The teeth matched Helena Marsh exactly. Her family was devastated. Her mother collapsed when she heard the news. Her younger brother reportedly did not speak for 3 days. On October 28th, Helena Marsh was buried in a small cemetery outside Manchester. 53 people attended the funeral. Prayers were spoken. Tears were shed. And the world moved on, as it always does after tragedy. But the world was not finished with Helena Marsh. On November 4th, 2003, exactly 3 weeks after her funeral, a woman walked into the Greater Manchester Police Headquarters. She was calm but confused. She carried a valid driver's license, a passport, and a set of house keys. She told the officer at the front desk that her name was Helena Marsh, and that she needed help understanding what was happening. She had woken up that morning in an empty field just outside the city with no memory of how she got there. The last thing she remembered was going to bed on October 13th. The officers thought it was a prank. Then they thought it was a mentally disturbed individual who had somehow obtained Helena's identification. But when they asked her personal questions, things only Helena could know, she answered every single one correctly. Her mother's maiden name, her childhood pet, the name of her first boyfriend, the specific address of the flat where she lived during university. Details that could not have been researched or guessed. And when they compared her fingerprints to records on file, the match was perfect. Helena Marsh was alive. But Helena Marsh was also buried in a cemetery across town. Forensic investigators were dispatched immediately. They exhumed the coffin that very night under cover of darkness to avoid public attention. Inside, they found the charred remains exactly as they had been buried. But when DNA analysis was performed on those remains, the results sent shockwaves through the department. The body was not Helena Marsh. The DNA did not match. But the dental records had been conclusive. How could teeth match perfectly while DNA told a completely different story? Helena herself could offer no answers. Under extensive psychological evaluation, she showed no signs of deception, no evidence of trauma, no indication that she was anyone other than who she claimed to be. When doctors asked her what she remembered, she described a strange experience. She recalled going to sleep in her bed. Then she was somewhere else, a place that was white and silent and infinite. A voice, neither male nor female, told her to walk forward. She did. And then she was standing in a field outside Manchester, with the sun rising over the hills. Here is what makes this case even more disturbing. Investigators later discovered that Helena's grandmother had experienced something remarkably similar in 1952. She disappeared during a bombing raid in London and reappeared 3 days later with no memory and no injuries. Some researchers now believe this was not coincidence. They believe certain bloodlines carry what they call temporal immunity, a genetic ability to slip out of fatal moments entirely. Helena Marsh is still alive today, and she has reportedly survived 2 more near-fatal accidents since 2003. Imagine you are an air traffic controller sitting in a quiet radar room on a summer afternoon in 1969. You are tracking a small private aircraft crossing the Appalachian Mountains when suddenly the pilot's voice crackles through your headset, tight with panic. He reports engine failure. He is going down. You listen helplessly as static fills the channel, followed by a sickening crash that echoes through your speakers. You dispatch rescue teams. They find the wreckage. They find the body. The pilot is dead. Case closed. But 4 hours later, that same pilot walks into a diner 200 miles away, orders a cup of coffee, and asks what all the fuss is about. This is the impossible story of Captain Marcus Webb, and it remains one of the most baffling aviation mysteries ever recorded. Marcus Webb was 38 years old, a decorated Vietnam veteran and experienced private pilot with over 3,000 flight hours logged. On August 17, 1969, he departed from a small airfield in Virginia on a routine flight to Ohio. The weather was clear. His single-engine Cessna had been recently serviced. There was no reason to expect anything other than an uneventful journey. At 2:34 in the afternoon, Webb radioed air traffic control with a calm but urgent message. His engine was sputtering. Oil pressure was dropping. He was attempting an emergency descent to find a clearing in the mountains below. Controllers tracked his position on radar, watching the small blip descend rapidly toward the forested ridges of the Appalachians. At 2:41, radar contact was lost. At 2:43, the open radio channel picked up a sound that every controller dreads: the unmistakable noise of impact, metal tearing, glass shattering, then silence. Rescue helicopters reached the crash site at 4:15. The Cessna had slammed into a mountainside at high speed, disintegrating on impact. Wreckage was scattered across a quarter-mile of dense forest, and in the crushed remains of the cockpit, rescuers found a body. The pilot was still strapped into his seat. His wallet identified him as Marcus Webb. His military dog tags confirmed it. His face, though bloodied, was recognizable. The county coroner was notified. The body was transported to the nearest morgue. The family was contacted and informed that Marcus Webb had died in a tragic accident. But here is where the story becomes impossible. At 6:47 that same evening, a man walked into a small diner in Charleston, West Virginia. He was wearing a pilot's flight suit, slightly disheveled but otherwise unharmed. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee and a sandwich, and struck up a conversation with the waitress. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb, said he was a pilot, and mentioned that his day had been strange, but he could not quite put his finger on why. When the waitress noticed a news report on the radio about a plane crash in the mountains, the man looked up with mild curiosity. That is when someone in the diner recognized his face from a photograph being circulated by authorities. Charleston, West Virginia, is over 200 miles from the crash site. There is no possible way a human being could travel that distance in 4 hours on foot through mountainous terrain. Yet, there sat Marcus Webb, alive, uninjured, with no explanation for how he arrived. When confronted by investigators, Webb appeared genuinely confused. He remembered the engine failure. He remembered the plane descending. He remembered bracing for impact. And then, he said, everything simply froze. The trees stopped rushing toward him. The sound of the engine cut out. He felt a sensation of being pulled, as if invisible hands were lifting him out of his seat. The next thing he knew, he was standing in an open field he did not recognize, his flight suit intact, his body unharmed. He walked until he found a road, hitchhiked to Charleston, and never suspected anything unusual had occurred until police arrived at the diner. The body in the morgue underwent DNA analysis years later when the technology became available. The results were staggering. It was a perfect genetic match to Marcus Webb. 2 bodies, 1 man, both identical down to the last chromosome. Webb lived until 2012, dying peacefully at age 81. But before his death, he told his grandson something that still echoes. I died in those mountains. Someone gave me a second version of myself. I have been living on borrowed time ever since. What if a child could see their own death before it happened? What if they drew it over and over in perfect detail, weeks before the moment arrived? And what if, after dying exactly as they predicted, they simply came back? This is the haunting story of Lucas Chen, a 6-year-old boy from Sydney, Australia, who somehow witnessed his own future, died in the exact manner he foresaw, and returned from death with a message that still disturbs investigators to this day. This case will challenge everything you think you know about time, consciousness, and the boundaries between life and death. In early September 2011, Lucas Chen was a bright, cheerful boy with a love of drawing and an imagination that delighted his parents. But something changed. Almost overnight, Lucas became withdrawn and anxious. He stopped sleeping through the night. He refused to play with his toys, and he began drawing the same image repeatedly, filling notebook after notebook with the same disturbing scene. His mother initially dismissed it as a phase. Children draw strange things. But when she finally looked closely at what her son was creating, her blood ran cold. Every drawing showed the same thing. A car, clearly her car, crumpled at an intersection. A large truck with specific markings on its side. And in each picture, a small figure lay on the ground beside the wreckage. The figure had X marks over its eyes. When she asked Lucas what he was drawing, he answered in a voice far too calm for a child his age. "That is me, Mommy. That is when I die." His parents took him to a psychologist, who found no signs of mental illness or trauma. Lucas was not disturbed. He was not acting out. He was simply certain, with an eerie conviction, that he had seen something real. He told the psychologist that people without faces had shown him what was going to happen. They showed him the car. They showed him the truck. They showed him lying on the street, and they told him he had a choice, but he did not yet understand what that choice was. On September 22nd, Lucas refused to get into the car. He became hysterical, screaming and crying, begging his mother not to drive that day. But she was running late for an appointment. She assured him everything was fine, strapped him into his car seat, and pulled out of the driveway. At the intersection of Parramatta Road and Morton Street, a delivery truck ran a red light at high speed. It struck the passenger side of the vehicle in a direct collision, exactly where Lucas was sitting. The impact was catastrophic. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but for Lucas, it was already too late. Paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. His mother survived with serious injuries, but her son, the boy who had drawn this exact moment weeks earlier, was gone. And then he was not. 47 minutes after being pronounced dead, with no medical intervention whatsoever, Lucas Chen's heart began to beat. Paramedics had already covered his small body with a sheet. They were preparing to transport him to the morgue, and then the sheet moved. Lucas sat up, looked around with calm, clear eyes, and spoke words that made every witness freeze. "I knew this would happen. They showed me, but they also showed me how to come back." Under careful psychological evaluation in the following weeks, Lucas described what he called the White Room. He said that after the crash, he found himself in a place with no walls, no floor, no ceiling. Figures surrounded him, beings made of light who communicated without speaking. They showed him the accident again, from above, and they asked him a question. "Do you want to see, or do you want to forget?" Lucas said he chose to see, because they told him that if he saw, he could find his way back. Lucas Chen is 19 years old today. Medical records confirm he was clinically dead for 47 minutes. Since his resurrection, he has reportedly predicted and avoided 7 more potentially fatal events. In an interview conducted when he was 16, Lucas said something that continues to haunt researchers. "Death is not a door, it is a window, and some of us can see through it. If this case gave you chills, you are not alone. But only 13% of our viewers are actually subscribed. Hit that button now, because the next story changes everything we think we know about survival. Imagine coming home from war, walking through the front door of your childhood home, and discovering that your family already buried you 3 months ago? Imagine standing at your own grave, reading your own name carved into stone, while your mother weeps beside you because she cannot understand how her dead son is holding her hand. This is not a ghost story. This is what happened to Sergeant James Holloway in the winter of 1953. And the United States Army classified the entire incident for over 6 decades because they had no explanation for how a man could die, be buried, and then simply walk back into the world of the living. James Holloway was 24 years old when he deployed to Korea in the spring of 1952. He was a well-liked sergeant from Cincinnati, known for his calm demeanor under fire and his habit of writing long letters home to his mother. He was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division and saw heavy combat throughout the brutal summer. On October 3, 1952, his unit was ambushed near the town of Chorwan. Enemy fire erupted from concealed positions. Men fell all around him. And in the chaos, James Holloway was shot twice in the chest at close range. 12 members of his unit witnessed him fall. A combat medic reached him within seconds and confirmed what everyone already knew. Sergeant Holloway was dead. His body was recovered, processed through military channels, and shipped home to the United States. On October 29, 1952, James Holloway was buried with full military honors in a small cemetery outside Cincinnati. His mother placed flowers on his grave every Sunday for the next 3 months. The war continued, the world moved on. And the story of James Holloway should have ended there. But on January 4th, 1953, something impossible happened. At approximately 7 in the evening, James Holloway's mother heard a knock at her back door. When she opened it, she found herself staring at her son. He was standing on the porch in his torn military uniform, looking confused and exhausted. His face was pale, his eyes were distant, but it was unmistakably him. She screamed and collapsed. Neighbors rushed over and called the police. When officers arrived, they found a young man matching James Holloway's exact description, carrying his military identification, answering questions that only James could answer. His fingerprints matched Army records perfectly, but James Holloway was buried in a cemetery 3 miles away. When investigators questioned him, James had no memory of being shot. He remembered the ambush. He remembered raising his rifle. He remembered a bright flash. And then, he said, everything became fog. He described walking through a gray featureless void for what felt like hours, maybe days. At one point, he looked down and saw himself lying on the ground, bleeding from the chest. I stepped over my own body, he told them. Something told me to keep walking, so I did, and then I was home. The Army ordered an immediate exhumation. Under cover of darkness, they opened the grave of Sergeant James Holloway. Inside the coffin, they found a body dressed in military uniform, decomposed but intact. Decades later, when DNA technology became available, samples were tested from both the exhumed remains and the living James Holloway. The results were identical. Both bodies, the dead and the living, shared the exact same genetic code. The military had no framework for understanding what had occurred. A soldier had died in combat, been buried at home, and then returned 3 months later with no explanation. The case was classified immediately. All witnesses were sworn to secrecy. James Holloway was given a new identity and lived quietly as a carpenter until his death in 1998. But in private letters to his sister, discovered after his passing, James wrote about the experience that haunted him for the rest of his life. I think I was supposed to die that day, he wrote, but something or someone decided to give me another path. Every night, I still see myself lying in that field. I stepped over my own death, and I have never stopped wondering what would have happened if I had looked back. Can a person escape death by simply walking into another timeline? James Holloway seemed to believe so. What if you could save your own life from the future? What if, at the moment of your death, a version of yourself that does not yet exist reached back through time to pull you from the edge? This sounds like science fiction. But in 1994, something happened on a Florida highway that left trauma surgeons, medical examiners, and physicists completely baffled. A woman died in a car accident, bled out before help could arrive, and was pronounced dead at the scene. But when her body arrived at the hospital, her fatal wound had already been surgically repaired from the inside using her own signature technique. This is the impossible story of Dr. Miriam Foster, and it will make you question everything you think you know about the nature of time itself. Dr. Miriam Foster was 41 years old and one of the most respected trauma surgeons at Miami General Hospital. She had pioneered a unique suturing method that colleagues called the Foster stitch, a technique so distinctive that other surgeons could identify her work at a glance. On the afternoon of March 15, 1994, Miriam was driving home after a grueling 18-hour shift when traffic ahead suddenly stopped. A chain reaction collision involving 15 vehicles erupted on Interstate 95. Miriam's car was crushed between a truck and a concrete barrier. A jagged piece of metal debris from the truck punctured through her door and impaled her abdomen. First responders arrived within minutes, but Miriam had already lost too much blood. Her pulse was gone. Her breathing had stopped. A paramedic checked for vital signs 3 separate times before calling it. Dr. Miriam Foster was pronounced dead at the scene at 4:17 in the afternoon. Her body was transported to Miami General, the very hospital where she had saved countless lives, so that her colleagues could process her remains and perform an autopsy. What they discovered in that examination room defies all medical logic. When surgeons prepared to examine her wound, they found that it had already been repaired. The metal had been removed. The internal bleeding had been stopped. Perfect sutures held the damaged tissue together with expert precision. And here is what made everyone in that room go pale. The suturing pattern was unmistakably the Foster stitch, Miriam's own technique, her own signature. The wound had been surgically repaired using materials from Miriam's personal emergency medical kit, which had been stored in the trunk of her car. A kit that no first responder had accessed. A kit that remained sealed inside the crushed vehicle until investigators retrieved it hours later. As her colleagues stood in stunned silence, Miriam Foster's heart began to beat. She regained consciousness slowly, confused and disoriented. She had no memory of anything after the moment of impact. But under hypnotic regression conducted weeks later by a team of psychologists and physicians, Miriam described something extraordinary. She remembered floating above the accident scene, watching her own body bleeding out in the wreckage below. She felt detached, peaceful, almost ready to let go. And then she was pulled back, not by paramedics, not by chance, but by herself. She described suddenly being inside her own body again, feeling the pain of her wound, but also feeling her hands moving with purpose. Except it was not her controlling them. It was someone else, someone who knew exactly what to do. I could feel her thoughts, Miriam said. It was me, but older, more experienced. She was calm. She told me not to be afraid. She said she had done this before. Miriam Foster returned to work 6 months later and continued practicing medicine until her retirement in 2015. In the years following her accident, she reportedly experienced 2 more incidents where injuries healed impossibly fast, wounds closing before her eyes as if guided by invisible hands. In an interview with a medical journal, she offered an explanation that still circulates among researchers who study consciousness and time. "I believe awareness can reach backward," she said. "I did not save myself in that moment. A future version of me did. She reached back through time and refused to let me die. Can a future version of ourselves intervene to prevent our death?" Dr. Miriam Foster believed so, and she had the scars to prove it. These cases are only getting more intense, and we have saved the most disturbing ones for last. Join the thousands who never miss an upload. Subscribe now before Case 4 rewrites everything. Imagine burying your daughters. Imagine standing at their grave, reading both their names carved into the same stone, and spending the next 25 years learning to live with a grief that never fades. Now, imagine those same daughters walking back into your village one morning, looking exactly as they did the day they died, not a single day older. This is not a folktale. This is not a legend passed down through generations. According to documents that Ukrainian authorities kept classified for nearly 2 decades, this is exactly what happened to the Kosoff family in the spring of 2003. And no one has ever been able to explain it. Anna and Vera Kosoff were identical twins, 22 years old, born in a small village in rural Ukraine. They were inseparable from birth, finishing each other's sentences, sharing the same dreams, moving through life as 2 halves of a single soul. In March 1978, they boarded a train to Kiev, where they planned to enroll in university together. They never arrived. Somewhere in the countryside, the train derailed at high speed. Carriages jackknifed and burst into flames. 147 passengers were killed. Among the dead were Anna and Vera Kosoff. Their bodies were recovered from the same car, found holding hands even in death. Their parents traveled to Kiev to identify them, a journey no mother or father should ever have to make. The girls were brought home and buried together in the village cemetery. A single headstone bore both their names. For 25 years, their mother visited that grave every week without fail. She never stopped mourning. She never stopped whispering their names. And then, on March 3rd, 2003, exactly 25 years after the accident, the impossible happened. 2 young women appeared at the edge of the village just after sunrise. They were confused, disoriented, and barefoot. They wandered toward the center of town, asking strangers what year it was. When villagers approached them, the women gave their names, Anna and Vera Kosoff. At first, people assumed it was a cruel joke or a case of mistaken identity. But then the women began recounting details that no outsider could possibly know. Childhood memories, family secrets, the nicknames their grandmother had given them. the location of a music box they had buried in the garden when they were 8 years old. Word reached the Kosoff parents within the hour. Their father, now in his 70s, walked to the village square and saw two young women who looked exactly like his daughters had looked a quarter century ago. He collapsed on the spot. Their mother arrived moments later, trembling so violently she could barely stand. She touched their faces, looked into their eyes, and whispered the same question over and over. How is this possible? The twins had no answer. To them, no time had passed. They remembered boarding the train. They remembered the car shaking violently. They remembered a blinding white light. And then they were walking down a road toward their village, with the sun rising over the hills. They had no awareness of the crash, no memory of death, no understanding that 25 years had vanished in what felt like a single heartbeat. Medical examinations confirmed that both women were physically approximately 22 years old. Their bodies showed no signs of aging, no evidence of the quarter century that had passed in the outside world. But when authorities ordered the grave exhumed, they found two sets of remains inside the coffin, badly decomposed but intact. DNA testing produced results that should have been impossible. The genetic material from the bones matched the living women perfectly. The dead twins and the living twins were the same people. Ukrainian authorities classified the case immediately. The family was sworn to secrecy. The twins were relocated to a small town where no one knew their history. They have reportedly lived there ever since, aging normally from 2003 onward, now physically in their mid-40s. But before the case was sealed, one of the sisters said something to an investigator that has never been forgotten. "We did not survive the crash," she said quietly. "We died on that train. But something moved us forward, past the moment of our death. We walked out of the grave before we ever fell into it. Imagine being strapped into an electric chair, a black hood pulled over your face, knowing that in seconds a surge of electricity will end your life. You hear the executioner's hand reach for the switch. You feel the leather straps cutting into your wrists. You smell the faint odor of burning that lingers in the death chamber from those who came before. And then nothing. No pain. No flash. Just silence. And 11 years later, you walk into a courthouse and ask why no one ever gave you your appeal. This is the story of George Whitmore, a man who was executed by the state of Louisiana in 1962. A man whose death was witnessed by 38 people. A man who returned from the grave more than a decade later to demand justice. George Whitmore was 29 years old in 1961 when he was convicted of murder in rural Louisiana. The evidence against him was circumstantial at best. No physical proof connected him to the crime. The only testimony came from a single witness whose credibility was later questioned. Many who followed the case believed George was innocent, a black man railroaded by a justice system that had already decided his fate before the trial began. His appeals were denied, one after another. And on June 14, 1962, George Whitmore was led into the execution chamber at Louisiana State Penitentiary. 38 witnesses watched as he was strapped into the electric chair. A priest read him his last rites. A black hood was placed over his head. The warden gave the signal. The executioner pulled the switch. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through George Whitmore's body. Witnesses later described the smell of burning flesh, the sound of his body convulsing against the restraints, the terrible silence that followed when the current stopped. A physician checked for vital signs and declared him dead at 12:07 in the afternoon. His body was released to his family. On June 17th, George Whitmore was buried in a small cemetery outside Baton Rouge. And for 11 years, that was the end of his story. In November 1973, a man walked into a courthouse in Baton Rouge and approached the clerk's window. He was calm, well-dressed, and spoke with a quiet intensity. He said his name was George Whitmore, and he wanted to know why his appeal had never been heard. The clerk assumed he was confused or mentally ill, but when the man provided details about his case, his conviction, and his execution, details that matched official records precisely, the clerk called security. Within hours, state investigators arrived. They fingerprinted the man. The prints matched George Whitmore's prison records exactly. They photographed him. His face matched photographs taken before his execution. They questioned him for hours, probing for inconsistencies, searching for evidence of fraud. He answered everything correctly. He knew cellmates' names. He knew details about the prison that only an inmate would know. He knew what he had eaten for his last meal. But when they asked him about the execution itself, his answer sent chills through everyone in the room. George said he remembered being strapped into the chair. He remembered the hood being placed over his face. He remembered waiting for the electricity to come. But it never did. Instead, everything stopped. The sounds of the chamber faded away. He felt himself being lifted, pulled backward through darkness. And then, he was standing in a field, in daylight, with no idea how he had gotten there. He wandered for what felt like days before eventually finding his way back to civilization. He had no awareness that 11 years had passed. Authorities exhumed his grave that same week. Inside the coffin, they found skeletal remains dressed in burial clothes. Dental records matched George Whitmore, but so did the living man standing before them. Louisiana had no legal framework for resurrecting the dead. A man who had been executed could not file an appeal. George Whitmore was quietly given a new identity and lived in obscurity until his death in 2001. But in an interview discovered years later, he offered his own explanation for what happened. God did not want me to die for something I did not do. So he moved me out of that chair before the electricity ever came. I do not know where I went, but I came back. Imagine dying in the cold vacuum of space, your lungs screaming for oxygen that is not there, your heart stopping as darkness closes in around you. Now imagine waking up and telling your crewmates that you just attended your own funeral. You described the weather that day, the people who came, the words spoken in your eulogy. You even described the date carved into your tombstone, a date 23 years in the future. And when that date finally arrives, you are still alive. This is the extraordinary story of Viktor Petrov, a Soviet cosmonaut who clinically died for 14 minutes during a classified space mission and returned with knowledge of his own death that would take decades to verify. And almost every detail he described came true, except one. In July 1986, cosmonaut Viktor Petrov was aboard a classified Soviet space station, conducting experiments that remain partially redacted to this day. Petrov was 36 years old, a veteran of 2 previous missions, known for his calm demeanor and meticulous attention to detail. On the 3rd day of the mission, during a routine spacewalk, the unthinkable happened. A malfunction in his suit's oxygen system caused a catastrophic failure. Within seconds, Petrov lost consciousness. His heart stopped. For 14 minutes, he drifted in the void of space, clinically dead, while his crewmates frantically worked to retrieve him and restore life support. Against all odds, they succeeded. Petrov was revived inside the station, gasping back to consciousness after 14 minutes without oxygen. By every medical standard, he should have suffered catastrophic brain damage. He should have been blind, paralyzed, or vegetative. Instead, he woke up alert, coherent, and deeply shaken, but not by what had happened to him, by what he had seen. Before his crewmates could even begin medical assessments, Petrov began describing visions in extraordinary detail. He told them he had witnessed his own funeral. He described the cemetery in Moscow, the gray October sky, the specific arrangement of flowers on his casket. He named mourners who would attend, including a young woman who had not yet been born. He described buildings in the background that did not yet exist. And he described his own tombstone, reading aloud the inscription that haunted him most. Viktor Nikolaevich Petrov, 1950 to 2009. His crewmates thought he was hallucinating, suffering from oxygen deprivation delusions. But Petrov was insistent. He demanded that every detail be recorded in the mission log. Soviet authorities debriefed him extensively upon his return to Earth, initially dismissing his account as trauma-induced fantasy. The case was classified and filed away. Viktor Petrov returned to civilian life. But over the following decades, his predictions began coming true one by one. The buildings he described in the background of the cemetery were constructed in the 1990s, matching his descriptions exactly. People he named as mourners were born, grew up, and came to match the physical descriptions he had provided. A nephew he described comforting his widow was born in 1988 and grew into exactly the man Petrov had seen. By 2008, every verifiable detail from his vision had proven accurate, every single one. As 2009 approached, Petrov became increasingly certain that his death was imminent. He put his affairs in order. He wrote letters to his family. He visited the cemetery he had seen in his vision and stood before the empty plot where he knew his grave would be. But 2009 came and went. Viktor Petrov did not die. He lived another 8 years, passing away peacefully in 2017, surrounded by family in a hospital bed, rather than the circumstances he had foreseen. Before his death, Petrov gave one final interview to a Russian journalist. His explanation for what happened challenges everything we understand about time and consciousness. "I saw my own death," he said slowly. "Every detail was correct, except the year. I believe I was shown what would happen, and by seeing it, I changed it. My consciousness traveled forward in time, and by witnessing my fate, I altered the thread. I was supposed to die in 2009, but knowing changed everything." Did Viktor Petrov glimpse his own future and, in doing so, rewrite it? Can witnessing your death through time actually prevent it from happening? The answer died with him in 2017. Or perhaps it did not. Imagine an entire town dying at once. Every man, woman, and child collapsing simultaneously. Their hearts stopping, their lungs emptying, their bodies growing cold in the Alaskan darkness. Now, imagine every single one of them waking up 72 hours later, at the exact same moment, with no memory of death and no understanding of what happened. This is not a horror film. This is not a legend. According to declassified military documents, this is exactly what occurred in December 1952 in a remote Alaskan settlement called Ravens Hollow. And what the survivors described afterwards suggests that death itself may be nothing more than a moment in time, one that can be stepped over, skipped, or erased entirely. Ravens Hollow was a small community of 287 people, isolated in the Alaskan wilderness, accessible only by air or by a single unpaved road that became impassable during winter. The residents were trappers, miners, and their families, hardy people accustomed to brutal conditions and long nights. On the evening of December 12, 1952, something appeared in the sky above the town. Witnesses from a nearby military outpost described it as an aurora unlike any they had ever seen, a rippling curtain of green and violet light that pulsed with an almost mechanical rhythm. At 8:47 that evening, the light intensified. And then, in less than 3 minutes, every single resident of Ravens Hollow was dead. Military personnel arrived the following morning, responding to a complete communication blackout. What they found was a scene of silent horror. Bodies lay everywhere, in the streets, in doorways, slumped over dinner tables. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication of disease. It was as if someone had simply switched off 287 lives at once. Preliminary reports attributed the deaths to an unknown atmospheric event, possibly a toxic gas released by unusual geological activity. The military established a quarantine perimeter and began preparing for mass burial. For 72 hours, nothing changed. Bodies remained where they had fallen, temperatures dropped, and the first signs of decomposition began to appear. And then, at exactly 11:47 in the morning on December 15th, every single body began to show vital signs simultaneously. Military doctors watched in stunned disbelief as hearts that had been silent for 3 days began beating in perfect unison. Chests rose and fell with breath, eyes opened. People sat up, looked around, and asked what was happening. There was no gradual recovery, no individual revivals. All 287 residents returned to life at the exact same moment, as if someone had pressed a reset button on an entire community. The survivors had no memory of the 72 hours they had spent dead. To them, only seconds had passed. They remembered seeing the strange lights in the sky. They remembered feeling a sudden heaviness, a pressure in their chests. And then they were waking up surrounded by soldiers, being told that 3 days had vanished and that they had all been clinically deceased. But under extensive debriefing, a remarkable pattern emerged. Nearly every survivor described the same experience during their death. They spoke of a place with no color and no sound, an endless void where they existed without bodies. Many reported encountering beings, entities without faces who communicated through thought rather than speech. And these beings delivered a message that was consistent across all 287 testimonies. Your time was miscalculated. You were given a choice. Step forward to return. Step back to continue. Every single resident chose to step forward. Medical examinations revealed no lasting effects from the 72-hour death. No brain damage, no organ failure, no cellular deterioration beyond what had already begun during the 3 days. It was as if death had simply been paused and then reversed. The military classified the entire incident. Families were sworn to secrecy. Ravens Hollow was quietly abandoned within a year, its residents relocated to various communities across Alaska. But something strange followed them. The survivors of Ravens Hollow lived unusually long lives, with an average lifespan of 97 years. Several reportedly developed the ability to sense when death was approaching others, intervening on multiple documented occasions to prevent fatal accidents. A resident who passed away in 2019 left behind a sealed letter that was opened after her death. "We were all supposed to die that night," she wrote. "Something disagreed. They moved us forward in time, past the moment of our death. We walked out of the grave before we ever fell into it. So we have to ask ourselves, what is death really? A doorway, a detour, or simply a moment that certain people can step around?" These 10 survivors didn't cheat death. They walked through it and came out the other side. Perhaps time isn't the straight line we've always believed. Perhaps some threads refuse to be cut. Only 19% of you are subscribed. Join now, because what we uncover next might change everything. What do you believe?